Hello and welcome in my another video of Redux. In the last video, we talked about we set up a basic Redux app in which we talked about how to set up the store, how can we set up the reducer, and how can we dispatch an action to the reducer. And while doing so, we talked about an action object which is supposed to contain two properties. One is of type, and that we specified in the last video too. And the other property that we are going to talk about today is that is payload. So right at the place from where we are dispatching an action to the reducer, we are going to, in fact, we already passed an action object. And this option object existingly takes only one property. And today we are going to talk about the second property which it can take, and that is payload. So in the payload, for now, since we are implementing a counter example, and by default, as we have seen, that our counter is getting incremented by only one, and that is hard coded inside the reducer. And now today, we don't want it to be hard coded like one. We want to pass a value while dispatching an action, and we want to increment this value by the value that we usually pass through the action. So how going to we do that? Let's simply pass the second property as payload, and you can give any payload. Like if I want to increment the value by 5, I can in fact pass the value of payload as 5. So I have just in fact introduced the new property in the action object, that is the payload. And right in here, we can pass that payload property right here too. But for now, just for the purpose of testing it, I'm just going to um, uh, receive this property into the reducer function. So inside this action object, we already are using action.type, and we can now use action.payload as well. So instead of in fact returning this state by incremented with the hard coded value 1, what we can do is in fact increment this existing state by the value which is being received by this reducer, like action.payload. So now what we're going to do is, in fact, if we are going to hit the increment button right in the UI, it is going to take this object, action object, and inside the action object, we are having two properties, type and payload. And this action object is being received here inside the reducer, and the value inside the action, or the payload inside the action, is being used over here. Now, the existing value of the state is 10 by default, and it is going to increment the value by the payload which is sent by the action itself from the UI. So now if we take a look at the output, so let's hit the plus button. It is incrementing the value by 5, and this is uh, exactly the value that is being passed from here UI. Now, if we decrement the value, it still is going to decrement it by 1 because we did not actually specify the payload right over here with this action decrement. So if we gonna do the same thing right with this, so it is going to decrement the value by the 5. But remember that if we are going to actually using the payload value over here, and we are not going to pass it from here payload, so this might give you an error. So just use the payload right over here, like 5. It's not mandatory. In fact, we have to use both of these values as same. In fact, you can give any value to this. Now, if I pass it 8, whenever I will be clicking on plus button, it would increment the value by 5, and when I'm going to hit the minus button, it is going to decrement the value by 8. So this is what actually increment and decrement with the payload. So let's again go to the UI and test it if it is working as our expectations or not. So if I hit the plus button, it is incrementing the value by 5. And if I hit the minus button, it is decrementing it is getting decremented by 8. So that's pretty much it about how can we actually use the payload, how can we pass the data with an action to the reducer. So currently this is only a simple numeric value, but we can in fact later on pass any data like array. We can also pass the object, we can pass the number and string or whatever you want.